Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Transport Tavern. Now, firstly, I'll just usual sound check, everybody. Can somebody please hail to me that they are in receipt of sound? And this will take a moment while the feed catches up. Um, just a yes or a no. Hello. Oh, we've got students and ex-students in. Hello, all of you. Um, Thank you, Owen. Loud and clear. So welcome to the Transport Tavern, and we got, a great show for you tonight. So, firstly, I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Nicola Forsdike. Welcome, Nicola. Could you just explain to us about sort of what you do and your interest in research and yeah.
Okay, so I suppose I returned to academia quite late. I had a long career in industry. My original profession is marketing. I didn't start out working for the railways, though I did end up there, and from then went into consultancy. And I suppose I spent about 20 odd years working in industry. And then about 8 years ago, had the opportunity to start work on a PhD at the management school at York, which is something I'd wanted to do for a long time. Particularly interested in how managers learn, how they form knowledge about their industries, what kind of knowledge you need to do innovation and exciting things in a new product development and things like that. So a lot of my research nowadays is around knowledge and knowledge formation, particularly among railway managers. But my original profession was marketing. I'm still a chartered marketer. It's very close to my heart.
Mhm.
And I thought it'd be interesting today to talk about railways and branding, sort of bring those two interests of mine together, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's very much an interest of mine as well. So yes, we'll have a good chat today. Firstly, we have to do the honours. What are you drinking, Nicola? You
So I went down to raid our beer cellar, which had a number of fine ales in it. The beer cellar sounds grand, but it's cardboard box in the front room. We had three Yorkshire ales in it. There was Saltaire, there was Ilkley Brewery, but the one I chose was an Aintree Ales, Cool Citra. So Aintree Ales are about 3 miles from where we live,
hmm?
and they've been doing drive-through all the way through lockdown. They've been doing a lockdown ale as well on draft. Sadly, we've drunk all that, so I'm on the canned Cool Citra, which I have to say is a very nice beverage.
Yeah, and I mean, when I'm up in York, I do. I've had quite a bit of their beer, and I do rate it as a really good brewery. So I really enjoy their work. So yeah, um,
So I have to say also I'm drinking it from a harvest glass in homage to my husband, who's from that part. Well, he's from West Sussex, so melding the two cultures, if
also
you
a
like.
very fine brewery. Well, I'm afraid I'm not on anything alcoholic today. I'm on the Red Bush Dragonfly Red Bush Earl Grey. So yes, can't be every week. So onwards. So our topic tonight is branding Britain's railways, change, continuity. So shall we head on to the first slide? Oh,
Yeah.
I've knocked
So
off the on there, but never mind.
yeah. So I think just before we look at the text here, do you want is so before people get drawn into those words, I think one point I'd like to make is the work I'm going to talk about here is drawn in part from research I did some while ago with Teresa de Silva Lopez, who I think you know,
Hmm.
David, at York. And that research looks at how contemporary railway brands draw on concepts of the past and of heritage. Um, I think there's also some more research going on, isn't there? You're going to have, is it Sophie talking in a few
Sophie,
weeks
in a few weeks, yeah.
about branding as well. So there's a lot of academic research done on railways. There's focus, but it tends to have a focus on transport economics. It tends to be about technology, high speed. And I think, as you've picked up before, there's not a lot of attention to branding and marketing. There's some exceptions in the business and economic history literature. So Colin Deval
Hmm.
and Hiroki Shin have done some work on that, and so have you.
Alex
Um,
Megcalf as
but did
well, yeah, yeah.
yeah, and Alex. But it's not. There's not a huge presence about railways within the marketing literature. And yet the evidence is that marketing and branding have actually been part of what railways do for over 100 years. Oh, don't believe this. My network's dipping in and out, so I hope we stay in touch with each
Yeah,
other.
you can still coming through fine.
Yeah, you still there?
Yeah. Can hear you,
If
Nikki.
you want to go, yeah, if you want to go onto the text slide, David, and just give people a minute, we'll give people a minute to read that. There we go.
Definitely not a modern phenomenon, I think. You can trace them back to the late 19th, can't you, in many ways?
Yeah. So I promise this isn't going to be a conversation based around text slides, but I found this quote, really liked it. And I think what I like about it is that it gets away, as you say, about the concept of branding being something. It gets away from the concept of branding being about products and selling things, and about something related to modern commerce. You know, as you just said, branding isn't really a new phenomenon. And I like the way it sort of suggests that the roots of branding lie in the human beings' need to belong. So Hirschman, that this quote was taken from, was writing in the journal Psychology and Marketing. So I think is writing about branding from a very human-centered perspective. Um, and I think there's a tendency to think of brands as being just about selling things, about building relationships, that you build emotional bonds between consumers and products or services, and that means we're more likely to buy things. But a lot of brand theory that marketeers use relates to 20th century studies about fast moving consumer. Um, so
You all right? Nikki?
yeah, you still there?
Yeah, sorry. Can hear you. Everybody, we seem to be having a bit of an issue on the line with Nikki here. Sorry about this. So, yes. Ah, you're back. There was this, everybody. We'll sort this out. Nikki?
You there?
Yes, I can hear you now. Nikki, can you hear me? Um, everybody, seems to be having a bit of trouble. I will just log in and my email and see if seems to be Nikki was having a bit of trouble with her internet connection. I can hear you now. No, yes, we worked this out earlier and it was working fine and it seems to have gone dead. So if you please bear with us a second, hopefully everything will come back. Make yourself a cup of tea, and we'll carry on. Bear with me. I'm afraid from my end, Skype has decided it wanted to die. Okay. I will try Nikki again. Hello. Right, I can see you now.
Excellent.
Should we try again? Right, we were on here. Thank you everybody for bearing with us. Right, let's yes. So Nikki, we were on about the idea about branding. It was being, you know, a background thing to sort of broader things. It's yes.
Yeah. So I think here what I like about this thing, they're talking about, you know, symbolic markers, and they and the fact that that branding is a lot of the contemporary theory comes from modern studies, consumer goods, washing powder and chocolate bars. I said I cut my marketing teeth in the marketing department of a national railway operator, and quickly became aware that the audiences for our band went way beyond consumers. And not only that, but the practice of branding in the railways really seems to date back from beyond where it was first codified as theory by marketing academics. So I think that's it's I'd say that what I like therefore about the quote we were looking at is the fact it sort of takes branding out of that modern marketing relationship and into something much more about human beings and relationships and senses of belonging. Yeah.
Cool. Shall we explore that in a railway context?
Yeah. Well, I thought I think we talk a bit about what we mean by branding, can't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think when we talk about branding, sort of the definitions, technical definitions that tend to be given are about them being names, terms, signs, symbols, you know, or a combination of them that are about identifying the seller of goods, and people using them to differentiate themselves from other people who are selling the same kinds of things. Yeah. But people also talk about them being sensory and about being about things, you know, so you make sort of emotional associations, so that when you buy something that's related to a brand, what the sort of value you get from it is not just about the value of using the product, but it has some sort of deeper meaning of that. And I really, really like this LMS poster on the left. It's got 3 different levels of branding. I think the poster is one of the set from the 1930s, isn't it, David? Was Coronation?
Yeah, I think it's mid.
Yeah, Coronation Scott was a 1937 introduction, was it?
Yeah, I think mid to late 30s even. I was going to say 60s, but yeah, 30s.
Yeah. So so it's got 3 levels of branding working here. You know, sort of top level, you've got the branding of the company. So you've got two aspects of that. You've got the letters, the LMS, standing for the company name in the bottom left, and you've got this gorgeous roundel, which we're showing in a bit more detail as well, because it's worth having a look at, because even that roundel has got messages embedded in it. So you've got, you know, the red rose. I guess it's supposed to be a Tudor rose, is it? An English rose. signifying England, and then you've got the thistle. So you've got this concept of the name and the images in the roundel are both about, something that links you into the geography. So at one level, it tells you very simply what the railway does, that it goes, sort of up the left-hand side of the country, or the west side of the country, linking the capital, London and Scotland. But it also, those are old symbols. The thistles and the rose are actually much older symbols. So it's sort of tying into sort of people's sense of nationhood, I think, as well. People's sense of belonging to a place. So it positions the railways, if you like, being it becomes part of my identity, or relates to my identity in a way, because it's relating to a geography that really matters to me. And that
Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
No, I just think that one of the things that railways tend to do is that they're, even in the Edwardian period and before, they build crests, they have liveries, they brand plates with their crest. It's all about building up a brand identity, would you say?
Yeah, I would. And I think if we think about, we'll talk in a bit about, why you might want to build that identity, and which audiences you're actually building that for. But I think that's this goes beyond just selling, getting people to get on the train, I think. And so at that level, you've got the sort of corporate branding that they about what the LMS itself might stand for. And I was watching your talk that you did on 20th of May, where you were
Yes.
talking about the railway shaping demand and stimulating journeys, and you were talking, some of the examples that you use there show them trying to differentiate themselves from each other on speed and on quality of what they were selling. And you've got that here, of course, with Coronation Scott. So
I think it's very much. I mean, something Colin says. I don't. I would be interested in what you think. He takes these. Not this image. I think it's a slightly different one about sort of that. There's something. That idea of sort of serving the nation, but at the same time, there's modernity embedded in the heart of it, as it were. So
yeah,
this is a very sort of, should we say, English scene, as it were, or should we say Northern English scene, or
yeah,
and that balance says something beyond simply this is a fast train and it's lovely.
yeah. And I love the balance here of the train with the landscapes.
Mm.
I can remember years ago when I was a marketing student, one of the case studies we were given was Cunard, and they were talking about how Cunard did its modern adverts, where it was putting liners into beautiful sort of landscapes of islands and ocean, and a lot of work they did on getting the proportion of the ships right against the landscape, because if you make them too small, then people find it a bit scary. They think the landscape's over dominating, and if you make them too big, then they find that unrealistic. So I love the balance that they've got here between the train,
It really
the train.
works. Yeah, I really like it. So,
And I was going to say, of course, it's going up Shap, so it's working quite hard as well. So you get that lovely trail of steam. Yeah, gorgeous.
should we go on to the next one?
Yeah, we can. Just checking. The other thing I want to say about here is Coronation Scott, of course, is addressing the premium end of the market that we talk about it in terms today. And I think Hiroki Shin has talked about the fact that the time when this was done, the railway revenues were actually falling away, and a lot of advertising spend is focused on cheaper tickets. So I think this really powerful image and this really classy poster is sort of, this doesn't say cheap to me, which I find quite interesting.
I mean, I've been
So
wondering about sort of a lot of posters. If actually, a stakeholder here is showing the railway companies as modern and vibrant, and sort of thinking about, well, the wealthier London market it would. I mean, there's something about to be talked about the geographical spread of where the posters were put up. Where are
yeah,
these
I think there
posters
is.
being displayed? Are they being displayed in London, or are they
Yeah,
and that's a key factor for me. Well, I've been thinking, should we say?
Mm. And I'm guessing you've still got, a strong core of strong business in Glasgow at this time as well. So you'll have a sort of business class of professionals based there as well that you're seeing this, and also in Manchester. So on the sort of northwest parts of the route as you go down. So what we've talked about there is we've got branding working at 3 levels. So we've got this corporate branding, we've got the product branding and of the Coronation Scott. And if it was just aimed at consumers nowadays, we'd probably just, we'd expect maybe the focus to be, or more until recently, to have been just around that product branding.
Yeah.
And then we've also got this sense of place, both through the logo that the company's using, the crest that the company's using, but also using Shap in the poster. And this tying into a sense of place and a sense of geography. So, which sort of leads us to the question of who the brand's aimed at, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, something I've been working on is the idea of, I might pronounce it, of polysemy. The idea that actually a poster or an advertise or a piece of advertising can be encoded with multiple messages that could be read in different ways by different audiences.
Yeah.
And I do wonder if that's, what extent, I mean, can we say advertisers this period were thinking actively like that?
Well, I think if you go on to the next slide, we can perhaps talk about these audiences. So I think, who was that LMS branding for? And I think, a lot of theory about corporate branding. So thinking about that LMS level of branding rather than just looking at Coronation Scott.
Yeah.
Is it's only in the recent 20th century that modern theorists say that these corporate brands have become visible. So they talk about, I think Balmer and Gray, Balmer writes a lot about heritage in brands and about corporate branding, says that corporate brandings are one of the most fascinating phenomena of the business environment in the 21st century. And that they're really, they're really important to multiple audiences. But for me, that Coronation Scott poster is the LMS are clearly using those different levels of branding. Unfortunately, we can't, we don't know why. So unless there happens to be a minute tucked away somewhere that records the decision-making process of the advertising department, we've only got the artifact to work from. We can't see that decision-making process. But for something like that, as you were saying, if it's going to be seen in London, it's going to be seen by not just the customers, consumers, but by other people too. And particularly, the kind of people who might be funding this kind of operation. So your financiers and other people, if they're travelling around by train, then they're too going to see the posters. And one of the things I was really aware of when I was doing marketing in the workplace is when you put a poster up, you can't control who sees it. So you can you certainly you control the space, but you don't control who space. Range of people, your own employees are going to be walking past it, and potential employees and potential political stakeholders and local community. So it's going to be a lot of different audiences see it, and what I like about that LMS approach, is that poster potentially carries a whole range of messages for different audiences, which is actually quite sophisticated.
Well, I think one of the things that strikes me about the sort of LNER's approach is that LNER tours the posters in exhibitions. And it's notable that they're getting, on the one hand, noted art critics and noted people in the art world to open up. So that's sort of sense of legitimizing it in the eyes of a certain audience. But also, in one year, they get the Minister for Transport to come and open it.
Yeah.
So that is a strategic choice to try and get him to come and open it.
Yeah.
So I think there is, especially by the 30s perhaps, when railways are sort of fighting against asking for legislation on things, there is a political dimension to showing themselves as organisations that have a degree of responsibility to the nation that, So
Yeah.
very political, but
yeah. And that's a sort of nice link into the next poster, isn't it? This concept of the art commissioning that they were doing, because this poster here was one of those royal academicians that they commissioned to produce work for them. And what I love about this is it's actually showing the workforce. So it's showing these guys actually laying the track.
yeah.
And whilst I've seen this is interpreted about being, reassuring, users that it means your track quality is really smooth, you can read a lot else into this. And there's a danger that we read it with, 21st century lenses on, and maybe read too much. But, you've got the guy at the front, he's got his lookout and he's got his red and green flags. So it's not just ride quality, but it's saying we understand safety as well, and we're taking care. And I love the guy in the bowler hat on the left. Like, who is he? It'd be great to know some background to this poster. And is he a senior engineer that that's dressed for the part, or is he one of the a director from the company that's turned out to watch what's going on? And so you're not just showing, you're showing a whole level of people who are working in the organisation. And I think if I was financing this organisation, I'd probably be quite reassured by that.
I'd personally be interested to know when exactly this poster came out. Because Wilkinson went round and he asked academicians, and he chose the subjects, and they had to paint them.
Yeah.
But it was announced coincidentally with the ASLEF strike. So there's a disconnect in the press between the posters coming out and the ASLEF action. And I wonder if this one came out, that was January, if this came out as one of the March or April or June, later posters, the lookout, it shows responsible for their employees, looking after the employees. There's I don't know.
Yeah. There's a lot of subtle messages in that. It'd be interesting to see if we can do some research and find out on that, wouldn't it?
The lookout is what raised it in my mind. So, but
yeah. So this is very much corporate brand image, and in fact, this whole thing about getting these professional artists in to paint the railways. You think about the sort of the status of the Royal Academy and its position in society in London, and the kind of people who would maybe go through through the Royal Academy exhibitions and stuff. This is not just about advertising to consumers, is it? I don't think.
No, I don't think it is. I think the fact they slapped so clearly on the bottom RA, and the way they publicise it, it's a managed PR relationship. You can see it in the press where you've got like 10 papers all saying almost identical things. It's a managed relationship with the press. It goes beyond simple selling services, and I think the main impulse for this whole series was to show themselves as responsible advertisers, to legitimize themselves, and there's so much more going on above the level of the services.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, and I mean, there is a sort of inertia here from the LNWR, who also had this wonderful poster of just its tracks. So I've always wondered sort of how much the sort of what came through after Group 1923. How did they choose what they drew on from the pre-grouping companies, and how did that shape their corporate identity in the public sphere?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to look at the continuity of personnel.
Yeah.
And relationships between personnel and things like that.
Yeah.
But I think we can say that all these images here go towards building a corporate brand image.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And it would be really interesting to know whether there's anything in the archives that gives us more background to this, and to say how it links to that the strikes and restoring image and all the rest of it. And I think one of the reasons why I find this whole issue of branding so interesting is, as we said earlier, a lot of the research on railway marketing to date has focused around things like advertising rather than these wider issues of branding. And I think it's partly because the railway companies at the time don't use terms such as branding, and when they're writing about things. And so for us as researchers, it's really hard to follow a document trail.
Yeah, I think the one I like is that they use the word advertising to mean what we would now consider marketing.
Yeah.
They use
Yeah.
propaganda a lot, which now has
PR.
connotations after the Second World War, particularly.
Mm.
So yeah, the terminology is you have to sort of decipher it a bit. So
And maybe it means we need to be open to different research techniques, a form of railway archaeology alongside that, so that we're interpreting not just the documents but also the artifacts that carry messages to us. So perhaps we can have a look at some of those artifacts, some of those things that survive. Yeah. So I think I'm right in saying that the early 1930s LMS began looking at a more corporate look. That after the railway grouping, they've sort of got this hodgepodge of companies, haven't they? Each with their own identities, and they're beginning to think about bringing that together. And what I find it really interesting is that a company is choosing to invest in a unified look a time when it's been suggested railways were actually struggling to compete financially. So if you're struggling to compete, why are you making your engines look really splendid? Why are you repainting your stations in consistent colours? So we don't, again, unless we can find some documents behind that show the decision making, it's hard to see. But I'd love, once we can get back into the archives, to see if there's anything there that would give us some evidence about that.
I mean, you've picked out here a couple of elements of railway, the brand. I mean, it's to my eye, it's very Midland in appearance, but the same colours, the same aesthetic across them.
Yeah.
Which is something, of course,
yeah.
in the underground context, Frank Pick, should we say, pioneered that sort of very uniform corporate look.
Yeah.
So.
And I think it's interesting when British Rail's Chris Green took over Network South East in the 1980s, he used a sort of similar device to unify what was a hodgepodge of services and stations. So, on one of the issues with contemporary rail franchising has been what seems to be a sort of constant repainting of trains, replacing station signs and so on when operators change. So it is interesting how they've done that. And it'd be good to do some more work around what the LMS were doing.
Well, I mean, I've done a little bit of work on the LNER and their sort of station, mainly on the garden competitions because they're really interesting. But because who doesn't like a lovely garden? But well, just as an aside. Let's just say the stations that didn't really have many passengers were always the stations that won. Bath had some time. I've got the figures for the winners, and I've got the figures for the footfall and the goods numbers, and I'm pretty sure that's how it's going to run out. But the LNER was actually many companies had a brighter station scheme, but the LNER was working with the psychology of colour and how it pleases some people. And they were really, there's this article in the LNER magazine about the chemical analyst, and was talking about psychology. So they were really, I don't know, I can't say how progressive that was at the time, but that's a really interesting sort of serious approach to thinking about brand, that brand.
Yeah. It's really interesting to talk about sort of corporate identity, which in theoretical terms we probably separate from branding.
Yes, of course.
So yes. Corporate identity is a visual expression of how a company wants to be seen. So it's, if you like, it's part of the physical manifestation of the thinking behind that, what the company is. And it's really important to how employees see an organisation, and indeed to organisational culture, which in a service industry are absolutely fundamental to brand delivery, and to creating a brand. So I find that very interesting.
Right. Sorry. Are we?
So I think we can move on through history a little bit.
Yes, I keep making that mistake between corporate identity and branding. I do know it, honest. I do know the difference, honest.
They are very heavily related to each other. Yeah. So, BR obviously faced similar issues to the LMS. They had a mix of different identities. They had multiple audiences. And I'm going to let you talk about these a little bit more, David. So
I did a little piece of, this is, forgive me, I've forgotten the gentleman's book. David Lawrence's book, British Railways Designed, which is very interesting for looking at design. The Lion and Wheel design is the British Transport Commission's design, very much by the head of the BTC, who wanted to create a very sort of heraldic looking design. And then you've got under the BTC the Railway Executive, which is running the railway. So you have different executives running different parts of the BTC, and they were not the best of friends for the period that the Railway Executive existed, up to 53. Yes. So this is the BTC's design as applied to tenders of trains and to some places. But separately, to assert their independence, the executive created the totem, I think it was called the Flying Hot Dog or something. I mean, the lion here was nicknamed by staff the emaciated lion or something. It was because it was so thin, but on the right. But the result is you get these two symbols, and the the executive very much tried to resist the imposition of this, and they more or less won, except for the few cat badges and a few tenders. So that the symbols of the early British Railways are very much an embodiment of corporate dysfunction. So yes, but it just shows how very large. I wonder if it's very large organisations where you've got a small number of people, essentially, how brands and the symbols come from are emerged from managerial processes and not particularly healthy ones.
If you look at that one on the left again, we've got the rose and the thistle again as well, which is quite interesting.
That's the slightly later one from the mid-50s onwards, yeah. So so Barry has said that the lion was also called a ferret and a dartboard. So, yeah.
I like it.
But there doesn't really seem to be a sort of cogent sense of getting all the symbols correct, getting uniformity until the mid-60s, and we get to the double arrow. So,
which brings us neatly to
corporate identity manual, etc.
Yeah, this is so different, isn't it, from what we've just been looking at. So we've got a rebranded British Rail designed to get away from that history and perhaps all the baggage that went with it, and move towards something much more modern. And I think we've got this detailed design manual that tells you how big the signs have to be, and what typeface to use, and how to do all your signage. So an attempt to get a really, really comprehensive look across the national network. And introducing this very famous, what some of my colleagues used to call the undecided arrow, that has one of the highest recognitions of brand, I think, used to be about 96%. But brand recall. Everybody knew this stood for railway, which of course is why it through what came beyond privatisation to be the total, the universal symbol for a railway station in this country. Yeah. So very, very high recognition of what it was. I think that's what's happening in the 60s, and I think if we go beyond this, you then get a sort of further complexity happening sort of 20 years later, when we move into sectorisation. So you still get British Rail branding incorporated into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think of course this is sort of very much embedded about, again, it's saying something more than simply just here's a service. It's saying mid-60s, moving away from the steam railway, moving away, places like Euston are being rebuilt at the time. It's very much wrapped up in that whole modernity of British Railways as against the car. It's, and trying to project BR as a modern, forward-looking organisation. And I'm here very much from this period, BR tends not to, it tries to eschew looking backwards to history a lot. We'll get Sophie's talking. I've heard Sophie talk before, and she says, in a few weeks, she says, in the 1970s, that's BR's history is back there. It's not something we're talking about today. So.
And I don't know if there's anything much written about this, but Beeching did bring in external marketing expertise with him, didn't he?
I think so.
I think I'm right. It'd be really interesting to really have a look at the impact of that sometime. Yeah. So
are we on to the next one, do you think?
I think we can move on to the next one.
Oh, you see that one on the right is my childhood. I'm a child of Southwest London, so yeah. Maybe not that one particularly, but yeah.
So what we've got here is the 3 passenger brands, if you like, that were introduced in the 1980s. So British Rail at this time has set up 3 passenger business sectors that are actually broadly related to the sort of type of markets they serve. So we've got INTERCITY at the top, who are doing fast trains between London and regional centres. So major cities, and of course the main lines up to Scotland and the southwest. And they've actually, you can see the swallow at the top there, sort of signifying speed, I guess. And they brought in a top branding agency, so I think it was Newton and Sorrell. Actually designed the logo there, and very splendid it looked too on the side of the locomotives. But you've still got that underpinning of the BR arrows at the bottom, showing it still belongs to that bigger corporate family. So again, we're back to branding almost at 2 levels. We've got we've got very much the corporate brand of British Rail, but then we've got another a quality signifier, I suppose, attached to that, with the INTERCITY name and the swallow for the INTERCITY branding. And then on the bottom right, we've got the red, white and blue of Network South East. And again, on the rolling stock, it's got the arrow showing that it belongs to the whole family. And on the left, we've got it would have been a provincial sprinter train, I suspect at the time that photo was taken.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so in fact in that you've got 3 layers. You've got the whole you've got the British Rail branding. You've got the blues and whites suggesting that it's a regional brand, not a southeast one or an INTERCITY one. And then you've got a sprinter, so that's supposed to signify that that train goes a bit faster than the usual urban services that provincial were running. So it was an attempt to begin to introduce a higher level of product quality and to differentiate it from the other services that regional railways or provincial were running.
Didn't put that on Pacers, did they? Or something like it.
Sorry?
They didn't put something like that on Pacers, did they? Or did they?
No, you didn't get sprinters on Pacers. Yeah, yeah. Definitely not. So we've got, again, we've got simple complexity, moving from the very simple corporate into something more complex once the corporate brand's established. you begin to loosen up a bit.
What I always found interesting that on the Network Southeast one, you've got that sort of 3 colour thing on the front, the sort of 3 bar, and
Yeah.
it's still on the ground, sorry, on the platform on the Waterloo and City branch of the London Underground now, but that would turn up. That's their that was their sort of non-textual marker that went everywhere.
Yeah.
And yeah, so again, that's another small visual signifier that you could apply to something that would trigger in someone's mind, this is a Network Southeast station.
So you would find it on the station signs, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
I think,
yeah.
and on the notices and on the timetables and all that kind of thing. So they're using that as well as alongside the name. And yeah, it's interesting. If you look carefully around the network, I think there are in some locations you can still find the old British Rail brands lurking, tucked away in corners. You have to look harder and harder these days, but
it is
they were very pervasive.
It is interesting, sort of growing up on that network, how it and that sort of sense of how it embeds itself in your mind when as a kid. But at Liverpool Street they still have some of the old clocks. They might have gone now, but they did until, and yeah, I look at them and I still think so that to me is a successful venture to this, the colours and everything. So because it's still in my head today.
Yeah, and it's very, very powerful. Yeah.
So back to the future.
Yeah, so privatisation brought us a range of new operators and a wealth of new corporate identities to go with that. And here is GNER, who were operating the East Coast Main Line in the 1990s. And I find it that they were a subsidiary of a much larger holding company, which also, I think I'm right saying, ran the Orient Express services. So they were subsidiary of Sea Containers, and I wonder whether that's partly why there's this whole nod to the past and to the you've got a roundel just like the old railway, the LMS roundel we were looking at earlier. You've got a lion and a unicorn here. You've for England and Scotland. You've still got the rose and the thistle. You've got these very old devices coming back in, and there's a lot we could talk about here about the use of heritage in branding. And I'm not going to go. I don't think we'll go into it because I think Sophie might talk about that. So I thought it would be interesting, rather than focus sort of on this historical aspect, to really think about this sort of sense of place that's in it. And for the final part of the talk, I thought perhaps we could talk a bit about the brand heritage that's related to our sense of belonging to a specific geography. So you were talking about how the Network Southeast logo takes you straight back to childhood and where you lived, and your location. Here we've got this harking back to that LMS geography, that sense of place, the London, Scotland, the thistle and the rose. So that sense of, and if we think right back to that quotation that we put up at the beginning about branding being related to our sense of belonging and our sense of community, I think it's quite interesting to reflect on how that relates to our geographical, where we feel at home geographically, and how we belong. So I think if we move on and look at some contemporary railway brands, we can see that. And what interests me is all these names were around in some form or another before privatisation. So these, although they've been used by post-privatised railways, we can think about brands that came into privatisation. We think like Virgin. I think maybe the architects of privatisation hoped that what we get would be these big consumer brands coming in, changing the image of railway. But actually, largely what we got was about brands about people and communities and the places that they belong to. So if we unpack some of these a bit, we can have a look at them in a moment in a bit more detail. But I find fascinating here that they are all using blue, for example. So you were talking just before about Eleni, about London North Eastern researching colour. And what colours to use. So when I was doing branding, they received wisdom as very much that blue is about reliable. So one of the reasons that Provincial was branded blue was because, if you're struggling to change perception from something that's not working very well, not running the trains on time, you move to blue. It's not very exciting, but at least it says we'll probably deliver what we say we're going to deliver. So that's embedded in. That's why a lot of uniforms are blue. And it's that's the psychology behind here. So and that they so that use of blue has been around certainly since, well, that BR colour was blue, of course, that old BR branding on the trains at least.
I suppose the sort of contrast to that today is that, like Great Western Railway, they use dark green, and that conveys heritage a lot of the time.
Yeah,
especially in a British context.
I don't know whether Sophie will talk about it, but I'm hoping she will. But that Great Western branding is very deliberately rooted in Brunel and the past. So very deliberately rooted. So within the marketing literature, this whole thing about brand heritage is a very specific context. So Balmer, who I talked about earlier, talks about heritage being about longevity. And what interests me about these brands is those names have been around since before privatisation. So I think if we can have a look at them, a couple of them in more detail, and just talk about that a little bit more. ScotRail, yeah. So the name ScotRail has been around since 1983, which makes it about 37 years old by my reckoning. So ScotRail was an anomaly under British Rail's business sectorisation. So in the 1980s, the once powerful regional organisations became suppliers to the new business sectors, and including the three passenger sectors that we looked at earlier. But ScotRail very much retained its status as an independent region. However, the marketing of the services was the responsibility of the sectors. And so in Scotland, that ScotRail name actually covered both intercity services and those with good memories from the couple of slides ago all recognise, there on the locos, you've got both an intercity livery and a provincial livery. So you've got that red stripe, that red go faster stripe at the top that harked back to the intercity livery. And then the blue at the bottom that was related to the provincial or the regional railways liveries. So you have both sectors using the name. If the image on the right is ScotRail today, which is very much a post-privatisation one. The identity is post-privatisation, and the actual imaging is developed and owned, I think I'm right in saying, by Transport Scotland. It's heavily linked to national identity, and its heritage draws on nationalism, the national flag, and if you can see under the ScotRail on the train, that what it says underneath it, it's got Gaelic underneath it, so it's tied into that traditional language. But the continuity in the logo fascinates me. You've still got a capital S and a capital R with lowercase letters. And the cross from reflecting the saltire and the Scottish flag is in the same position as the undecided arrow. So that might be because it works better from a design point of view, and it's not a conscious decision to do it that way. But nevertheless, what it gives is that visual continuity. So you've got a name and some sort of visual continuity in the way it's presented in the logo. That's now survived for several generations of managers, which is actually one of Balmer's criteria for a corporate brand, that it has to survive more than one generation for it to be a genuine heritage brand rather than something that's got longevity.
I was just wondering, because with LNER, we'll see how that is essentially a heritage brand, how long that survives beyond, because I suppose you could argue that's a brand that's effectively survived with a death in between of what 50 or so, 50 or 60
Well,
years.
slightly less than that, because of course GNER is
Suppose,
very. You've only got one letter change.
yeah.
It's quite closely related.
Mm.
Yeah,
They were clearly trying to riff off that original, yeah.
yeah. They would try to take the good bits without, maybe without some of the baggage.
I've
Yeah.
got something really interesting here from Ken's just mentioned something. Branson apparently Richard Branson asked if he could withhold his branding on the railways until he got his nice new trains, and was told no, as it was felt that the Virgin would try harder if their brand was obvious.
Yeah. And that's an obvious one, because if the product you're delivering is not quality, then it's going to damage that corporate brand right across your portfolio.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Right. Next one, shall we?
Yeah, so the next one's local to me.
Oh,
And I'm not sure how long this name, the TransPennine name, has actually been around. I suspect it may even predate sectorisation, and certainly my very limited model railway collection has got a Trix unit from the 1960s, billed as a TransPennine DMU.
hmm.
So that concept of the sense of geography and place for the TransPennine region seems to go back some time. So under the time of sectorisation, it was what you would call a product brand, designed again to differentiate faster trains
Hmm.
with a more comfortable one. So the TransPennine trains ran between the major northern cities, connecting cities, and they were trying to separate them out again from the run of the mill urban services. So by my reckoning, the TransPennine element of the name has been around at least 60, possibly been around 60 years or more. And I know that the full TransPennine Express branding has been used for over 25 years, because I actually did the research that ended up with the Express bit being added to TransPennine to put the name together. So at the moment, the brand is currently a subsidiary of First Group. So in a way, it wouldn't fit the bill of a corporate brand in the way that old LMS brand did, or even of ScotRail. Although ScotRail's also operated is a subsidiary of another operator. But nevertheless, they're standalone companies in their own right, albeit owned by an owning group, and they have these names that link them very much to their local geography and to their sense of place. So that the livery on the left is the Northern Spirit livery, the identity which came in very briefly before privatisation. But was eventually subsumed into a northern brand. So, and then TransPennine became franchise in its own right and stood alone. So yeah, we've got a name in Balmer's term. That name's been around, let's say, at least 60 years. It's got longevity. Very much related to geography, very much related to people's sense of place. Again, I think it'd be really interesting to do some more work around that, and to this whole importance of place, and the role it plays.
I do like that. Oh, just an aside, I do like that the new livery. The way
Yes.
it's really, but again, that is very the new trains. They're very new trains, and they're modern, and the livery fits with that whole aesthetic they're going for now.
Yeah. Smart. That's smart. It feels like an intercity service for the north of England at last.
Yes, yeah, and of course, a lot of these things being, and it goes back to what we were talking about sort of in the 30s, are framed by a political, this is the era of Northern powerhouse, debates over a new high speed line. it's very much framed by a political dimension, especially when you're talking about public services like the railways.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, branding is, if you look at an ITT, an invitation to tender for a modern franchise, under the pre-COVID system anyway, one of the things that the operators had to do was lay out their brand strategy, and it formed part of their discussions with the Department for Transport, and in the case of Transpennine with Northern Powerhouse. So it wasn't a purely, I don't think we can say they were purely commercial decisions in a way. There was those very powerful stakeholders were probably part of that decision making process.
So, is that the last slide? Or?
Yeah, and I think if I was going to sort of wrap up, what I'd say is there's actually little focus in the literature on railway marketing per se. As we've talked about advertising and PR, but on the wider aspects of marketing and what it's for and what it does, it's perhaps underrepresented in the literature, and certainly railway branding is not widely talked about, and in a way, that is perhaps because, as we've done here, you have to take a route of archaeology rather than pure history. We don't always have the archival evidence as to why a particular decision was taken, and we can only see the sort of physical evidence that survived. We can't say that.
Do you think that there is, so you said railways, but public services generally, like, there's a lot on commercial profit-making companies in a sort of, straight consumer goods sense, but the London County Council tramways had posters, they had a design schematic, and public services, I work for public libraries, councils invest in their brand. So
and I think that's partly about where the heritage of theory on branding comes from, which is very much from research initially into consumer goods companies, into the private sector. And indeed, a lot of the work on service industries, let alone public sector, but a lot of the work on service industries only began at the end of the 20th century. So there's been this big focus on physical things, whereas I think, one of the joys of creating a brand in a service industry is it's not just about doing your advertising and spending money on TV. Your employees create it daily, which I think, going back to that sort of LMS poster and when we're talking about there, your LMEs, your employees are a really important part of creating that brand, and that they're a big audience for what you do. And I think if we take that first quote about branding being about belonging to a social group, that the concept of place brands really makes sense. Not just for users, but also for your employees and for your local communities and your political stakeholders. And I don't think there's a lot of research around this. There's some work being done on interconnected stakeholders, which talks about how somebody who's a consumer one day might be the parent of a consumer another day, might be a local community member, and so instead of being able to place our audiences into very distinct groups, life's a lot messier than that. So you're talking to multiple audiences, even if you're only trying to talk to one. And I think that'd be a really interesting thing to explore, particularly in the terms of the earlier railway history. And what was going on there.
I think you see what's something that you take away from just flicking through the LNER magazine is that advertising notes, which Cecil Downridge wrote, he was the advertising manager, he wrote from 1929 up until the Second World War, is all about imbuing in the workforce an understanding of what they're doing and why it's important and how they're part of it. It's enabling the staff to be part of everything they're trying to create.
Yeah, I think that's a really great sort of example of what we've been talking about here.
I don't know if other railway companies did it. It's so blatantly because the LNER, I think, was one of the leaders in terms of what they put out. But I imagine most of the companies were trying to do the same. And to get also external stakeholders instead of in terms of the LNW before First World War were trying to coordinate the sort of, you say, how people perceive North Wales as a sort of region across local stakeholders and themselves. So the advertising for North Wales, if you get it from the North Wales Advertising Board and the LNWR, is strangely similar. Well, not strangely, but
Yeah, yeah,
stakeholder management.
yeah. So there is some modern literature on place branding. So branding as of destination, so destination branding. So the concept of regions or cities being in competition with each other, and you're having to do something to build up your destination as a place people want to come to. So we could, in a way, that's a separate thing from this sense of belonging about branding and employees, and I think they both make really interesting areas to do some more work on.
And of course, currently one of the ways that railways do that, or train operating companies, is through community rail partnerships and creating an identity for a line that resonates beyond.
Well, we could do a whole another webinar on those.
Well, exactly. Cool. So I think that's a really great place to wrap up. Thank you so much, Nicola, coming and talking with us about. I just find this subject fascinating, and no doubt we'll talk behind the scenes about this again.
I was going to say I'm really looking forward to being able to talk in a real pub and talking about this in more depth
I think we all are
in time.
So
and apologies for our internet connection,
yes,
and thanks for sticking with us. So
thank you for bearing with us, everybody. We got 26 people on the show. That's watching, so that's really fantastic. So what next time? So next time we've got Susan Major, who will be talking about the Million Go Forth, early railway excursions, working class excursions, and she will be debunking some myths. So that's next week. I really recommend you choose in. Susan's done some really fascinating research, and it's great to have her on. The other thing I'm going to give a shout out, as I do every single time, is the MA in Railway Studies. We are actually full now, which is great to know. We've filled up. We are taking expressions of interest for the year of entry 2021. So if you're interested in railway history and want to take your knowledge a bit further, or not just a bit further, but a large extent further, there's all the details there. It's 3 years online, British railway history and transport history. We cover other modes and we cover personal mobility and changes in that. So that's that. And so all that remains is for me to thank Nicola for coming on. Thank you so much. And yes, well, see you next time, everybody. Bye.